The early evening sunlight poured over the valley like molten gold, illuminating the small town of Willow Creek in hues of amber and peace. The scent of pine and earth mixed with the distant hum of life. Children laughing by the creek, an old man sweeping his porch, a couple walking their dog past the bakery. Everything seemed to breathe a kind of timeless simplicity. For Michael Carter, the sound of the gravel crunching beneath his car tires as he turned into Main Street felt like a melody from another lifetime. He had once known every face here, every crooked fence, every tree that leaned too far toward the river. But now, after 22 years, the familiar looked foreign and as if he were walking through a photograph of his past that had been left out in the sun for too long. He parked his dark sedan in front of the general store and sat there for a long moment, staring through the windshield at the life he had left behind. Once this very store had been his first job. He could almost see his 17-year-old self carrying wooden crates and pretending not to look across the street at Elena Brooks, the girl with the copper hair and bright eyes who worked at the flower shop. She had been gentle but strong, soft-spoken but certain. She was the kind of person whose presence could steady a storm. And for Michael, who had grown up in chaos and poverty, she had been the first thing in his world that made sense. But life had taken them on different roads that never crossed again. Until now, Michael had built his empire from nothing. He had clawed his way up from a local scholarship kid to the CEO of one of the most respected real estate and architecture firms in the country. His name was printed in magazines and business journals, his ideas praised at conferences, and his designs admired by those who had never met him. But behind the glass towers and applause, he carried an emptiness that success could not fill. He had wealth, yes, but no warmth. He had recognition, but no rest. And in the quiet hours between flights and boardrooms, he would sometimes wonder, what if he had stayed? What if he hadn't left the girl who once believed in him before he believed in himself? When he stepped out of the car, the crisp autumn air hit him like a baptism. The breeze carried the faint scent of wildflowers and freshly baked bread. He walked slowly down the sidewalk, his polished shoes clicking against the pavement, drawing a few curious glances from locals who sensed a stranger in their midst, though he was no stranger at all. Passing the old library, now renovated with new glass panels but the same stone foundation, he caught sight of something that made his heart pause. Through the window of the Willow Creek Community Center, he saw her. Elena Brooks stood near a group of children, helping them paint small birdhouses. Her copper hair, streaked now with threads of silver, was tied loosely behind her back. Her laughter drifted faintly through the open window, the same light, melodic laugh he remembered. She wore a soft green sweater, simple jeans, and an expression of peace that seemed to belong to someone who had made peace with the world and herself. Michael found himself unable to move for a moment. It wasn't just nostalgia that gripped him. It was something deeper, something that reached into the place in his soul that success had never touched. For a long time, he stood outside the window, hidden by the reflection of the late sun, watching her help a child fix a crooked brushstroke. There was grace in the way she moved, a quiet authority that came not from power but from purpose. She hadn't seen him yet, and part of him didn't know if he wanted her to. Because what do you say to the one person who once knew your dreams before you did? What do you say to the one you left behind for a dream that left you hollow? Finally, as if drawn by some invisible current, he stepped through the door. The familiar creak of the wooden floor greeted him, and in an instant, the years fell away. Elena turned at the sound, and for a moment the world went still. Their eyes met, his carrying the weight of decades, hers filled with a startled softness that quickly steadied into calm recognition. "Michael Carter," she said, her voice gentle but sure. "I never thought I'd see you back in Willow Creek." He smiled, but there was sadness beneath it. "I could say the same about myself." "You haven't changed much, Elena." She gave a small laugh. "That's not true, and you know it. Life changes us all, even you." "I suppose it does," he replied, looking around the room. "You're still building things, I see. Only now it's with color and kindness instead of bricks." "These little hands," she said, glancing at the children who were now whispering curiously, "build dreams. Sometimes the small creations matter more than the grand ones." There was no judgment in her tone, but her words struck something in him. He nodded slowly. "You're right. I've built towers, Elena, but I think I forgot what it means to build something that lasts." They talked for a while as the children finished their projects. It was polite at first, surface level, cautious, two people measuring the distance between what was and what is. She told him about her work with the community, how she had stayed after her father's passing to take care of her mother, how she eventually turned her love of teaching into a mentorship program for underprivileged kids. He told her vaguely about his company, about travel and projects and responsibilities. But she sensed the emptiness in his voice. He spoke of success like a man describing a distant country, familiar but uninhabited. When the class ended and the children filed out, Michael hesitated. "Would you have coffee with me sometime?" he asked, his tone uncertain, almost shy, a stark contrast to the man who once commanded rooms full of executives. Elena smiled, though there was a flicker of hesitation in her eyes. "There's a cafe across from the old post office. Tomorrow morning, 10 o'clock. But only if you're ready to remember who you were, not who the world told you to become." He nodded, understanding more than she realized. As he stepped back into the cool evening, the town lights beginning to flicker on, Michael felt something stir within him. A quiet, unfamiliar sense of hope. For the first time in years, he wasn't thinking about his next deal or his next flight. He was thinking about tomorrow. That night, as he sat alone on the porch of the old family home he had bought back from the bank years ago but never visited, he found himself haunted by memories. The laughter by the river, the promises whispered under starlit skies, the girl who had believed in love without guarantees. And he wondered if maybe, just maybe, life was offering him a second chance, not to relive the past, but to redeem it. The next morning dawned soft and golden, the kind of autumn morning that made the air smell like warmth and wood smoke. The streets of Willow Creek were quiet except for the occasional hum of delivery vans and the bell above the bakery door, jingling each time a customer walked in. Michael Carter sat at the corner table of the old Post Cafe, the very place Elena had mentioned. The cafe itself was charming in its simplicity, wooden floors that creaked underfoot, faded photographs of the town's history on the walls, and sunlight streaming through wide windows that overlooked Main Street. It was a place untouched by ambition, where time slowed enough for people to actually listen to one another. And for Michael, that was a novelty. He had arrived early, as he always did, his instinct for punctuality a remnant of the corporate discipline that had shaped his life. But as he sat there, nursing a cup of coffee that had long gone lukewarm, he realized he wasn't here as the CEO of Carter Developments or the architect of glass towers and skyscrapers. He was here as a man who, for once, wasn't sure of his next move. There was a strange humility in that realization, and for a man who had spent years mastering control, humility was both uncomfortable and liberating. When the bell above the door chimed softly, Michael looked up. Elena stepped inside, her presence instantly altering the rhythm of the room. She wore a long beige coat over a simple cream sweater, her hair loose and gently tousled by the morning wind. She carried no air of pretense, no trace of self-consciousness. She simply existed in her own calm gravity, and that alone seemed to command attention. As she spotted him and smiled, something inside Michael shifted, a small, unspoken ache that reminded him how long it had been since he'd felt seen for something other than what he could offer. "Morning," she said as she sat down across from him. "You look like you've been here for hours." "Just 20 minutes," he said with a small grin. "I guess old habits die hard. In my world, being early is a form of control." "And in mine," she replied gently, "it's a form of anxiety." He laughed softly, a genuine sound that came from somewhere deeper than courtesy. "I suppose you're right. I'm still learning how to just be. Maybe that's what you came here to remember," she said, folding her hands on the table. "How to be." For a while they spoke lightly, about the town, about mutual acquaintances, about how life in Willow Creek moved at a pace that the rest of the world had forgotten existed. But soon the conversation deepened, almost of its own accord. It was as if years of unspoken words had been waiting for this quiet morning. This sunlight, this table. Michael told her about his company, his successes, and then, almost involuntarily, about his failures, not the kind that showed up in balance sheets, but the ones that left scars inside. He told her how he had built everything he thought he wanted only to realize that in chasing his dream, he had sacrificed his joy. He spoke of boardrooms filled with people who smiled for contracts and bonuses but not for each other. He confessed that for all his wealth he had never really built a home. Elena listened without interruption, her eyes steady, her silence full of understanding. When he finished, she leaned back slightly, studying him as though she were seeing not the man in front of her, but the boy he had been, the boy who once promised her that he would build something that mattered. "You've done incredible things, Michael," she said quietly, "but somewhere along the way, you started measuring value with numbers instead of meaning. You were always meant to build things that healed people, not just house them." Her words landed with the precision of truth. He had heard countless critiques from investors, competitors, and journalists, but nothing had ever struck him like that single sentence. He stared at her for a long moment before saying, "You always did have a way of seeing through me." Elena smiled. "You used to like that." "I still do," he admitted, his voice low. "It's terrifying, but it's honest. And I think I've spent too many years surrounded by people who only tell me what they think I want to hear." For a moment, silence stretched between them, not awkward but intimate, the kind of silence that carried more weight than words. Outside, the wind stirred leaves along the sidewalk, and the sun slipped behind a slow-moving cloud, casting the cafe in softer light. Michael glanced at her hands resting on the table, slender, unadorned by jewelry. "You never married," he said gently, more statement than question. Elena's gaze met his, calm but reflective. "No, I came close once years ago, but I realized I didn't want to build a life that was convenient. I wanted one that was true, and truth doesn't always come when or how we expect it." He hesitated before asking, "Was it because of me?" The question hung in the air, trembling with all the weight of years lost and words unspoken. Elena looked down at her coffee, stirring it absently, though the cup was nearly empty. When she finally spoke, her voice was soft but steady. "It wasn't because of you, Michael, but it was because of what I felt for you. What we had, it shaped me. It showed me what real connection could be, honest, kind, imperfect. And after that, I couldn't bring myself to settle for less. So I stopped trying to find replacements for something that couldn't be replicated." Michael felt the air leave his lungs, a strange mixture of pain and awe filling his chest. "You waited all this time?" "No," she said, smiling faintly. "I lived. I built a life. I took care of people. I traveled. I learned to be enough for myself. But yes, part of me remembered. Not in a way that chained me to the past, but in a way that guided me forward. You were never my unfinished story, Michael. You were my reminder of what love can mean when it's real." He was quiet for a long moment, tracing the rim of his coffee cup with his finger. "I don't know if I deserve that kind of grace." Elena's eyes softened. "You don't have to deserve it. You just have to recognize it." Something inside him broke open then, not in the way of pain but of release. For years he had built his life around control, perfection, ambition. But sitting across from the woman who had loved him without condition and lived without resentment, he felt himself return to something he hadn't realized he'd lost, his humanity. They walked after coffee, down Main Street toward the bridge that crossed Willow Creek itself. The water sparkled under the sunlight, the current slow and rhythmic carrying fallen leaves downstream. They stopped midway, leaning on the wooden railing that had stood there since before they were born. It was the same place where, at 17, he had kissed her for the first time. He remembered it vividly, the trembling excitement, the scent of pine, the warmth of her hand in his. Now, standing there again, older and marked by life, that memory no longer hurt. It healed. "Do you ever wish you could go back?" he asked softly. Elena shook her head. "No, because if I went back, I'd miss the lessons that came from loss. Life doesn't give us the same moment twice, Michael. But sometimes it gives us the same person to see if we finally learned what to do with them." Her words lingered like the taste of sunlight. He turned to look at her, realizing that this, her strength, her calm, her quiet conviction, was what had always drawn him to her. Not her beauty, though she was still beautiful. Not nostalgia, though it was strong. It was her truth. And for the first time, he wondered if the universe had led him here not just to revisit the past, but to finally understand it. As the sun began to dip lower, casting golden light across the water, Elena turned toward him. "You've built a lot of things in your life, Michael. Maybe it's time to build something that doesn't need blueprints." He smiled, feeling the words settle deep within him like seeds ready to grow. Maybe it's time I learned how. They parted that evening with a promise to meet again, not because of romance or nostalgia, but because of understanding. And as Michael drove back to the old house, the fading light flickering through the trees, he realized that he was beginning to measure his life differently, not by achievements, but by awakenings. That night, for the first time in years, he slept without dreaming of deadlines or profits. Instead, he dreamed of a wooden bridge, a quiet town, and the woman who taught him that sometimes the greatest success is finding your way back to the person you were meant to become. The days that followed drifted through the town of Willow Creek with the calm certainty of autumn itself, slow, golden, unhurried. For the first time in years, Michael Carter woke not to the blare of phone alerts or the anxious ticking of his digital calendar, but to the soft rustle of leaves brushing against the windows of his childhood home. The house had been silent for so long that even the sound of his footsteps in the hallway felt like an intrusion. Dust covered the picture frames on the mantel, old photographs capturing moments frozen in a simpler time. His parents laughing at a picnic, his younger self in graduation robes, the town parade passing by the very house that now stood as a quiet monument to the years he had spent elsewhere. He poured himself coffee and stood by the window, looking out at the street where he had learned to dream, fight, fail, and start over. For the first time, he felt that maybe he hadn't come back to fix something broken. Maybe he had come back to understand what truly mattered. Elena Brooks had been on his mind constantly, not in the restless, infatuated way of youth, but in the quiet, steady rhythm of realization. Her words from the bridge echoed in his thoughts like a mantra. Sometimes life gives you the same person to see if you've learned what to do with them. He thought about how she lived, simply, purposefully, without the constant hunger that had driven him for decades. She had built meaning without money, happiness without applause, and peace without permission. That was a kind of wealth he had never known how to earn. A week after their meeting at the cafe, Michael found himself at the Willow Creek Community Center once again. He had told himself it was just curiosity, that he wanted to see what kind of work Elena was doing with the children, but he knew it was more than that. Something inside him longed for the authenticity of that small building, a place where laughter mattered more than luxury, and effort mattered more than outcome. As he stepped inside, the sound of children's voices filled the air, their energy bright and unfiltered. Elena stood at the far end of the room, surrounded by sketches pinned to the wall, rough pencil drawings of a playground. When she noticed him, her expression shifted from surprise to warmth. "Michael," she said, wiping her hands on a cloth. "You're early again," he smiled. "I guess old habits really don't die." "They can if you let them," she replied, nodding toward the wall. "We're working on a new project, a community playground near the old riverbank. The town council gave us permission, but we don't have the funds or a plan yet. Just dreams and crayons." Michael studied the drawings, swings, slides, a treehouse, laughter immortalized in lines drawn by small hands. Something about it stirred him deeply. "Who's designing it?" he asked. By mid-December, his time in Willow Creek had stretched longer than he had planned. His mother's health had stabilized, the doctors optimistic about her recovery, and yet he had delayed his return to the city 3 times already. The company was running fine without him, a sign of good leadership, he told himself, though part of him knew that it was also a sign of how easily the world moved on without any one man. When he wasn't at his mother's side, he found himself helping Elena at the community center, repairing shelves, repainting walls, or sometimes just listening to the stories of people who came there. Widowed mothers, struggling farmers, young kids with dreams too small for cities but too bright for silence. He began to understand that leadership didn't have to mean control. Sometimes it meant listening. Sometimes it meant simply showing up. One late afternoon, as he and Elena finished putting up winter decorations in the library corner of the center, she caught him staring at the garland lights flickering above the window. "You've been quiet," she said gently, setting down a box of ribbons. "What are you thinking?" He took a long breath before answering. "I'm thinking about how I spent my whole life chasing the next big thing. But standing here, I realize that maybe the big thing isn't out there at all. Maybe it's right here. The small things that actually matter." Elena smiled softly, but there was something wistful in her expression. "You sound like a man who's finally coming home to himself." He turned to face her fully, his gaze steady. Maybe I am. But home doesn't mean much if you have to leave it again. She hesitated, sensing what was coming. You're thinking of staying, she said quietly. I'm thinking of not running, he corrected. All my life I've been building things to prove I belonged in the world. But when I'm here with you, I don't have to prove anything, I just am. That's a feeling I don't want to lose. Elena's eyes softened, but her tone was cautious. Michael, don't mistake peace for permanence. This place, this version of yourself, might only exist because you finally paused long enough to feel it. If you stay just to escape your old life, it'll find you again in another form. Her words, as always, were sharp with truth. He said nothing for a moment, just looked at her. This woman who never demanded, never chased, never tried to fix him, but simply reflected back the man he could be if he allowed himself to be real. What if I stay because it's not about escape, he said slowly, but about finally choosing where I belong? Elena looked at him then, truly looked, and for a heartbeat all the years between them disappeared. Then you'll know, she said softly, not because of me, not because of guilt or nostalgia, but because it will feel like breathing. Over the next few weeks, something began to shift between them. It wasn't spoken, nor was it rushed. It existed in glances that lingered longer than before, in the quiet comfort of shared work, in laughter that came without effort. There was no confession, no declaration, only understanding like two rivers quietly merging under the surface. For Michael, it was the first time love felt like calm instead of chaos. For Elena, it was the first time faith felt like fruition instead of waiting. But life, as it often does, has a way of testing what the heart begins to believe. On the first week of January, a headline appeared online. Carter Developments announces mega urban project. CEO's return expected to finalize deal. The board had acted without his direct approval, using his name to secure a massive expansion in the city, a deal that would employ thousands but destroy a stretch of historic land on the city's outskirts. His silence had been interpreted as agreement. Within days, his assistant called again. They need you in the office, Michael. The investors are pressing. If you don't show up, the whole deal could fall apart, and so could your company's future. He stood there in the empty community hall after the call ended, the sound of the dial tone fading like an echo of his old life clawing its way back. He felt the pull of two worlds again, one that promised stability, power, and legacy, and another that offered peace, connection, and meaning. The choice that Elena had warned him about was no longer theoretical. It had arrived at his doorstep. That evening he walked to her house. Snow had begun to fall, blanketing the roofs in soft white. When she opened the door, her face was lit by the warm glow of the fireplace behind her. She didn't need to ask what troubled him, she already knew. He told her everything, the deal, the pressure, the expectations. When he finished, silence filled the space between them. Finally, she said, Michael, sometimes doing the right thing costs more than we're prepared to pay. The question is, can you live with yourself if you don't? He looked into her eyes, the reflection of the fire dancing in them. If I walk away, I could lose everything I built. And if you don't, she said gently, you could lose everything that makes you you. For a long time, he said nothing. Then he took her hand, not as a plea, not as a confession, but as a grounding. I don't know how to do this, he whispered. You already do, she replied softly. You just have to remember that integrity isn't about what you keep. It's about what you're willing to let go of. That night, as snow blanketed Willow Creek, Michael Carter sat by the fireplace of his childhood home and wrote the hardest email of his life. He informed the board that he was stepping down as CEO, effective immediately, and that he would dedicate his remaining shares to fund community projects in underprivileged towns, starting with Willow Creek. When he pressed send, a strange stillness filled the room. Not relief, not regret, just peace, the kind of peace that comes when a man finally stops running from himself. He leaned back in the chair, watching the flames dance, and realized that for the first time in decades, the fire burning before him matched the one inside him, not for success but for purpose. And in that moment he understood that he hadn't lost everything. He had finally found it. The morning after Michael Carter sent the letter that changed his life, The sky over Willow Creek was a shade of silver that seemed to hold its breath between night and day. The snow that had fallen through the night still blanketed the rooftops and the fields, unbroken and clean. A world reset. Inside the old family home, the fire had gone cold, but the air carried the quiet warmth of decision. Michael stood at the window with a cup of coffee growing cold in his hands, staring at the town that had become both his mirror and his redemption. The world he had once worshipped, skyscrapers, applause, prestige, was now miles away, and yet for the first time in his life he felt neither fear nor loss. He felt something better, release. He had stepped out of the machine he had built and realized that freedom was not about having more. It was about needing less. By noon, the news had spread. Some headlines treated his resignation as a fall from grace. Others called it an act of courage. Messages flooded his phone, half from those who admired him, half from those who questioned his sanity. "You could have been a legend," one of his investors wrote. "You just threw away a lifetime of work." Michael read that line several times before deleting it, realizing that what he had thrown away was not his work, but the illusion that it defined him. He walked outside, the air crisp against his face, and followed the familiar path toward the community center. The streets of Willow Creek were alive with quiet motion. Shopkeepers sweeping snow from their steps, children dragging sleds, the smell of fresh bread wafting from the bakery. Nothing extraordinary, and yet everything meaningful. When he reached the playground by the river, he stopped. The wooden structures gleamed with frost. The bright colors muted under the snow, and the sound of children's laughter echoed faintly from somewhere up the hill. He smiled. What they had built was not a monument to him or anyone. It was a space for joy, and joy, he realized, was the most honest kind of legacy. Elena found him there a few minutes later, wrapped in a wool coat, her cheeks pink from the cold. She didn't speak at first. She simply stood beside him, following his gaze toward the frozen swing set. For a long while, they watched the breath of the river rise like steam into the pale air. "So it's true," she said finally, her voice soft but steady. "You really did it." Michael nodded, his breath clouding between them. "I did. I resigned. The company will go on without me, and maybe it should. It was never supposed to be my prison." She looked at him with a quiet mixture of admiration and sadness. Most people spend their whole lives chasing that kind of success. It takes courage to walk away from it. He gave a faint smile, or maybe it just takes exhaustion. Either way, it's done. Then, after a pause, he added, "I thought I'd feel lost without it, but I don't. I feel whole for the first time." They walked slowly along the riverbank, the snow crunching beneath their boots. The world felt smaller now, more intimate, but also more real. Michael spoke about his plans to turn part of his savings into a foundation for rural education and community development. "I want to build things that last beyond me," he said. "Not in concrete, but in people." Elena listened quietly, her eyes shining with the same warmth that had drawn him to her decades ago. "You're doing what you were meant to do," she said. "All those years of building cities were just preparing you to build lives." Her words lingered in the cold air, wrapping around him like a quiet benediction. They reached the small wooden bridge that crossed the creek, the same bridge that had seen their first kiss, their reunion, and every moment of silent understanding between them. The water beneath was half frozen, thin ribbons of silver winding through the ice. Michael rested his gloved hands on the railing and turned toward her. "Do you ever think about how strange it all is?" he asked. "How life circles back. 20 years ago, I thought leaving this town was the only way to become someone, and now coming back feels like the only way to be myself." Elena smiled, her breath forming little clouds. "That's the secret, isn't it? You spent half your life running away from where you started and the other half trying to find your way back." For a moment, neither spoke. The quiet between them was filled with everything that didn't need to be said. Gratitude, regret, forgiveness, and something softer, something that had waited patiently for its time. When he finally spoke again, his voice was low but certain. "Elena, I don't know what the future looks like. I don't know if I'll ever rebuild another company, or if I'll spend the rest of my life here teaching kids how to draw straight lines. But I know one thing. I don't want to keep living without the people who remind me why life matters. And you're one of them." She met his gaze without flinching. "Michael, I don't need promises. I've learned that love doesn't always mean forever. Sometimes it means presence, showing up, staying true, being real. If that's what you mean, then I'm already here. He reached out and took her hand, their fingers interlocking like a vow. The years of separation, the weight of ambition, the ghosts of what-ifs, all of it seemed to melt away in that single touch. It wasn't the rekindling of a teenage romance. It was the quiet recognition of two souls who had walked through their own fires and emerged ready to build warmth instead of walls. The weeks that followed unfolded like the slow thaw of winter. Michael began teaching architecture workshops at the community center, guiding young students not just in design but in vision, how to imagine spaces that brought people together instead of shutting them apart. Elena continued her work with the children, often roping him into art projects that left his hands covered in paint and his heart unexpectedly light. Together they helped the town secure a grant to expand the center, and soon new rooms began to rise, one for music, one for learning trades, one for stories. The hum of hammers replaced the silence that had once haunted Willow Creek, and everywhere he looked, Michael saw reflections of the truth he had once forgotten. Real progress was measured not in square footage but in shared laughter. One evening, months later, a letter arrived at his door. It was from a young architect he had mentored years before, now heading the very firm Michael had left behind. "You taught us to build higher," the letter read, "but you reminded us that height means nothing without humanity. Thank you for showing us the difference." He read the letter twice, folded it carefully, and placed it inside a book on his desk. Then he looked out the window toward the lights of the town and smiled. Maybe legacy wasn't about being remembered by many. Maybe it was about being remembered rightly by a few. Spring came gently to Willow Creek. The river ran free again, the meadows turned green, and wildflowers grew along the paths near the playground. On one clear afternoon, as the sun leaned low in the sky, Michael and Elena sat together on the same bench where the journey had quietly begun. The air smelled of new beginnings, fresh soil, warm pine, and distant rain. Around them, children played, their laughter ringing like music. Elena leaned back, closing her eyes, the sunlight tracing her face. "Do you ever miss it?" she asked after a while. "The world you left behind, the noise, the speed, the certainty." Michael thought for a moment before answering. "Sometimes I miss the illusion that I was important," he said. "But then I look around and I realize that importance isn't the goal. Connection is. I used to build things to be seen. Now I build things to last." He looked at her, his expression calm and full of quiet wonder. "You taught me that," she smiled, her hand resting over his. "You taught yourself. I just reminded you what it sounded like." They sat there as the light began to fade, the town around them slipping into that golden hour when everything looked touched by grace. A soft wind moved through the trees, carrying with it the scent of blossoms and the promise of rain. For once, Michael didn't think about tomorrow. Tomorrow would come as it always did, but it no longer carried weight or worry. It was simply the next page of a story that, for the first time, didn't need rewriting. When the first drops of rain began to fall, Elena laughed and stood, pulling him up by the hand. "Come on," she said, her eyes shining. "Let's get caught in it." They walked through the drizzle, past the playground, past the bridge, their laughter mingling with the rhythm of the rain. In that moment, they weren't two people defined by success or sacrifice. They were simply alive, walking forward together into whatever waited beyond the next bend of the river. Later that night, as thunder rolled softly over the hills and the rain tapped against the windows of the old house, Michael sat at his desk and began to write. Not reports, not blueprints, not speeches, just words. He wrote about Willow Creek, about the people who built hope with their bare hands, about a woman who believed that love was not about possession but purpose, about a man who finally learned that fulfillment had never been somewhere else. It had always been waiting inside him, quietly, patiently, like home. When he finished, he closed the notebook, set down his pen, and looked out at the night sky. The storm had passed, leaving behind a hush so deep it felt sacred. Somewhere in that silence, he understood the truest lesson of his life, that happiness is not something you chase. It's something you choose. And in choosing it, you choose yourself, and everyone whose heart beats alongside yours. Outside, the moon broke through the clouds, washing the town in silver light. The river shimmered, the playground gleamed, and from the distance came the faint echo of a child's laughter. Pure, bright, endless. Michael Carter smiled, leaned back in his chair, and whispered into the quiet room, This is what forever feels like. End of story.